Hi everyone, my name's Simon and welcome to our rendering teardown section. Today we're gonna have a look at this pretty nice exterior night rendering. So first of all, like what we can sort of notice is that like in terms of detailing and texturing or whatsoever, it's really good work. Like I really like the detail of the metal cladding here, which is really nice and quite simple, but still recreates some interesting shading. And also the brickwork is quite nice. The other thing that works really well is also the way the lighting is sort of spreading inside the whole house, so that you sort of understand that it's like a mezzanine with like opened on the back here, and it's sort of yeah, interesting to see, so I quite like it. If there is one concern that I have, it's basically in terms of like the whole composition is a little bit odd, because basically, as you can see, we have like two things. First is that if you just make pop-up a sort of rule of thirds, you can see that the building is right in the middle of the whole image, which makes it a little bit, it's not that it's not interesting, but usually when you put it building right in the middle of your image, you might want to have something like more frontal, because usually it works better, or it will work well if you have a more organic architecture. But when it's more something like quite orthogonal, you might want to put it somewhere like on the left third or right third or something like that. So what I would do is to crop that way maybe. So basically give it a little bit more of ground, because there was not much ground here, so it's not that good, and give it like more of a sky area, so that you have like your building on the lower third and the right third here. I think it's a little bit better in terms of composition. The other thing that the problem that we have is that in terms of foliage here, as you can see, we have the building here, but the problem is that the building, the mass of the building is just at the exact same point as the foliage, which is kind of not a great idea, because what you want is to really emphasize the nice shape of your facade. So what I would do is basically to completely delete the foliage and just recreate it somewhere else. The other problem that I have is with this, it really seems like some sort of HDRI sky that was blurred to get some interesting lighting, so it's good, but when you do that, you also have to think about changing it afterwards, because this really doesn't look nice. Like, you have a really cool 3D model, so it would be nice to have like a sort of cool sky. So what I would do is get rid of the foliage, bring a new sky in, desaturate it a little bit, and basically recreate the foliage. It's just like a principle. I mean, like the foliage that were used here is really, it's really nice. Like it would totally do the trick, but it's just like, instead of having it here, you would want to have like the mass maybe around here, maybe a little bit behind that, but not just right on top of the house, because it's just gonna break the whole geometry. So there we go. The other thing that we can sort of have a look at is so just in terms of sky, I think it's interesting to have something kind of light here to really have a contrast between these two points, because otherwise, if you have like a too dark sky, it's going to be the same problem then with the foliage, because you're not going to read the geometry. So basically that's what you want to avoid. So maybe you have like some sort of proper foliage here, and etc. When we look at what's happening in terms of contrast, you can see it's something you want to like kind of have a look at. Is you have lighting coming out from the inside of the building, so you might want to check that it also lights up a little bit the surrounding, like the direct surrounding of your image. So maybe you have to sort of emphasize the lighting here, just on the grass or something like that, but just a little. It's not too much. One thing that you also can play around with is this usual burn and dodge tool that you have here, which is really useful when you want to. It's really useful basically when you have some sort of a really seamless texture, but you want to integrate some sort of discrepancy at some point because, well, like your metal cladding is not going to age exactly the same way, so it's a good way of inserting some sort of variety. And it's the same with the brickwork here, if you want. It's kind of subtle, but still it changes quite a bit the perception of the contrast you have. And the dodge tool on the other side is really interesting when you want to emphasize the lighting, like create some sort of really subtle halo around the artificially lit area. So that's something you might want to look at. Really subtle, but still it can make quite a big difference. So, and as you can see, it creates some really interesting effects because you have to set it to highlight so that it just pops out on really specific areas, and that way you sort of recreate you get more depth in your textures, because here it's lacking a little bit of some sort of displacement or bump mapping if you want. So here on the other side it's pretty nice here, although I'm sort of wondering why it's so bright, but it doesn't really matter. So here it's kind of interesting, although something you might want to check, I'm not sure, but I think when you get some basically when it works in terms of contrast, what you want to have is have the highest contrast on your point of interest and sort of have more faded atmosphere in the background, because if everything is contrasted the same way, you're not gonna be able to draw the attention to specific points because everything has the same weight. So what you want to do is maybe sort of change this and get a little bit less dramatic sky, but that way it doesn't overshade the building. So it's kind of subtle, but still I think it's better. Another thing that we want to have a look at is a couple of stuff. What I can say also is, like, there was some question regarding populating, and it's really interesting here because we have like it's some sort of like a isolated, so it's kind of interesting in this case to have just like one single person, because anyway, since this is just like some sort of family house, you're not gonna get like 20 people in here, or not even, maybe just a couple, but it could be interesting to have maybe just like some guy sitting in this chair here, or maybe someone washing his hands at the basin here. Something extremely simple and subtle and yeah, simple. So regarding saturations, I think it's working pretty well here. There's a couple of things. Yeah, no, it's working pretty well, but always check your saturations, because basically here you can see that the inside, which is artificially lit, is more saturated, which is a good thing, because basically artificial lights increase overall saturations, whereas natural light tends to sort of have a homogeneous effect on the overall saturation of an image. So this is sort of okay. On the other side though, like the other thing that is good with this new sky is that, as you can see, in the very beginning we had like the same hue, which is not something you want to have, because basically if this is sort of purplish and this is purplish as well, it's harder as well to recreate some sort of contrast between the two planes, and that way you cannot really read the geometry. So that's good if we have this sort of like orangish sky. But the thing we notice here, and that is kind of problematic, is the foliage or the grass. Basically what you have to know is that when you're dealing with foliage and you want to put it in the shades, the trick is not to just decrease the overall brightness, because basically when something is in the shadow, it's not getting just darker, it's also its hue and its saturations are changing. So what you need to do is have a hue saturation adjustment layer, and as you can see, I changed the hue to something more purplish, because basically what it's doing is that it's reflecting, it doesn't have direct light, so it's just reflecting the sky, so you would have some sort of orange tint at some point, and if it's just this hue we have here, that is going to be reflected. So if there's no direct light or artificial light on your grass, it has to be some sort of bluish. And also you have to increase just a little the saturation, because when something is in the shade, it gets a little bit more saturated than when it's in daylight. So I guess that's pretty much it. So as you can see, it does quite a big difference. Maybe you want to change a little bit the opacity, but so basically you also have to be careful with how you switch from like this part, which is lit by the artificial light. So maybe you could sort of colorize and add some sort of saturation and paint here, so that you have something, so that you understand that this is going that way. So, well, you would have to change the color a little bit more subtly, but it can be something like that. But it has to be really subtle. And what is interesting is how you can work the transition between the artificially lit area, then the indirect area here with artificial light, and then the naturally lit area with the sky reflected. So basically that's something that's kind of hard to grasp at first, but it's really interesting to work on, because it's gonna give a way more depth to your image and more realism. So it's kind of something quite interesting. I think that's pretty much it. Like, I think it sums it up. There wasn't much to do in terms of like time of post-processing, but it's just like it really changes the overall mood. Well, anyway, when you're dealing with skies, you have to try like maybe 20 of them before you actually find what's working. But basically, the idea you have to keep is that you have to have some sort of high contrast between these two, or otherwise we're not really able to read the geometry. And I think that's pretty much it. I hope you found it useful and that you've learned some tips and tricks for your next images, and yeah, don't hesitate to drop a comment or any review or any comment you have in mind, and yeah, see you in the next video. See you guys.